Hey everybody, how's it going? My name's Ben Snowden. Today I'm going to talk about Playfab service from Microsoft, and it's basically a tool or a multi-tool for multiplayer services. Um, who am I? Because that's always I feel like the first thing to get out of the way. I'm part of the Corrupted Media Productions team. Work with SeanBomb.com on a few games and a few projects. Pretty active VR enthusiast. I've played with VR for several years, probably coming up on 9 years now. Of just either been developing, playing, etc. Unity is my world space, but I've been in a few other engines as well. But Unity is kind of where it's at for me. It's also a Kennesaw State University graduate in 2021, I believe. Time isn't real to me, so that felt like a long time ago. And then I added this one on recently, but Microsoft Game Ambassador. Really, all that means is just I'm in an inner group with some Microsoft folks for Playfab, so I kind of get to ask some direct questions and kind of work with the inner side of the Playfab community to kind of help bring problems and solutions to everybody else, or just ask Microsoft nicely for it because I don't work at Microsoft. So now we got that out of the way. What is Playfab again? At its as kind of like a higher level here. I like to always kind of describe it as three core pillars. I'd say it provides multiplayer services, live ops services, and data and analytics services. And that's super high level there, but there's a bunch of sub features that you can kind of get out of these pillars to put in your game and help you kind of leverage a lot of cool stuff pretty out of the box with not a lot of setup. Something I wanted to touch on pretty early on was the pricing for such a software as such, because sometimes people would like to know that before they decide whether it's worth listening or giving their time to listen about this. So, talk briefly over pricing. I have it on the screen here, but for the past 4 years that I've used Playfab, and I've had several 100,000 different sets of accounts flow through. I've been able to stay under the kind of free to start or on the upper end of the free to start level. There's different tips and tricks you can kind of do to stay under there, even if your title fluctuates around over 100K. But just kind of here as you do, I kind of always feel that Playfab has had a pretty fair set of a kind of like developer package for you to kind of learn Playfab and even launch titles pretty early with it, especially in the indie realm. I feel like it gives you very much runway to mess with. Something I didn't mention at all, not related to pricing though. If you have questions, I'm fine with you putting them in the chat. I have it up next to me. I'll try to address them if they're relevant to the topic I have, or if they're coming up in another slide, I'll just kind of mention that it's coming up. But definitely feel free to ask them as they go, and I'll try and address them as short as I can. But the pricing model kind of sits with the free to start, which I said I've been able to stay in for a couple of years pretty well. And then kind of goes into an expanded pay as you go, where you're only paying for the things you go over over kind of the free to start metrics. And then as you get up into the standard and premium plan, you kind of start having more and bigger gauges on the amount of storage and data and events you can send and before you're getting throttled. Really just wanted to put these on the screen for the recording for people that wanted to see it as we go, but here's just a little deeper dive in some of the Playstream events and kind of the amount of data you're allowed to throw across. So I'm just going to kind of click through these for just let them sit on the screen for a couple seconds, but I just wanted to have these prepared so you can see how that scales. Awesome. So going from there, and I can always pull that back up later or drop links, etc. Should be able to be pretty resourceful with that. Where can you actually use this Playfab thing, this tool from Microsoft? Well, funny enough, it has it basically is supported in most languages that games are made of. I've used the C# version, the Python version, and I've messed with a little bit of the JavaScript version. And they all are just different ways to do basically the same thing. And then out of the box, there is a Unity SDK and Unreal SDK that you can use and get right into your game immediately, and it has custom engine support to kind of help you onboard pretty quickly. And then the platforms on the right as well kind of supports more than that. I think I just kind of put those big five there, but kind of supports mostly any platform that I've seen so far, even like Nintendo Switch and stuff like that. So not to be scary, but I always like seeing what big games exist that use a type of software or that I might be looking at to put in my game stack. And so I went across and did some just digging around and kind of found some of the bigger games that utilize Playfab. Rainbow Six being one of them, and then I didn't know Roblox did, but apparently Roblox utilizes a little bit. Forza Horizon 4, Halo, Minecraft, Doom Eternal, a lot of big titles have been able to scale up and utilize Playfab as needed. Also, I'll throw that, a couple of these are Microsoft games, so it makes sense that they would throw Playfab into their service here. But games like Rainbow Six, I believe, has been using it for quite a longer period of time and have been able to scale quite properly. So just kind of thought that was neat. Want to throw that out there. That's always something I like to see. All right, so going into, I'd say, a mid-level version of these Playfab features. We mentioned this earlier, that is like multiplayer services, live ops, and data and analytics. Gonna go down a little bit of each of these. I didn't make a slide for each of these services, or we would probably be here for over an hour, maybe closer to two. So I just kind of hit on some of the bigger, more basic stuff. But I wanted to kind of mention here at a high level that the multiplayer services is kind of mainly what I utilized with some live ops. But in fact, I think I made an entire screen for this. But like, it comes out of the box with very simple things: leaderboards and statistics. Being able to do multiplayer matchmaking, so like helping players find each other to make rooms based off whatever stats you want to kind of utilize. And then one of the biggest things that actually pushed us, us being when I was working on a title with Sean, or still am, but when we were, was the cross-platform identity and data. This is probably the biggest block I'm going to talk on today, because we were launching games on Steam and the Meta Quest. And so let's say you have a Steam game that you want to also work on Nintendo Switch or something like that. Since this is like a database that's not attached to any type of OS, right? Like Nintendo Friends or Xbox Friends or PS5 or PlayStation, all that kind of stuff. It's all detached, that you can have a really easy way to kind of set up this cross network identity that works pretty seamlessly, and we were able to utilize. That being said, why should you listen to me talk about Playfab in general, like me particularly? So I think I mentioned it before, but been using it since 2020 or 2021 ish, probably a little bit forward. So that's honestly probably closer to 5 years now. Have had a title out that it's utilized Playfab for 3 years ish, 3-4 years. And was able to benefit a lot from, even in that free tier, help us manage our game post launch. We're doing like simple things like feature flagging and being able to manage stores and stuff that I'll kind of get into more as we get into this presentation. One of the biggest things I learned is, from doing it with the title the first time around, I took a lot of do's and do nots from it. And so now that we're working on a second title that's going to utilize Playfab in our stack, I found what different approaches I might need to make. And so basically I've been through the cycle of, okay, this is what it's good, this is where we had problems, or this is where we caused our own problems, and this is what we would change going into our next title, which is now. So that all being said, as I had mentioned before, I might be talking fast. If I need to slow down for anyone, please mention that in the chat. No problem with criticism here. And then also, if you have any just generic questions or general questions, please feel free to drop those. So our first title that I mentioned used Playfab. I wanted to kind of go down the list of kind of the things we utilized in this title. And so the out of the box things that we mentioned and used, the biggest one was definitely the player accounts. The player accounts for us allowed a user to have identity, had data to come back to, was able to connect users together and kind of, manage a lot of stuff, right? A kind of quick glimpse at what our game was. It was Vertical Shift 2.0, or the Vertical Shift that is currently out is kind of the game that I'm going to be pointing towards a lot of examples here, if anyone has seen or is familiar with any of that. But basically, the player accounts gave us the ability to kind of manage that identity that we wanted to give the player. Right? We didn't want, especially as a multiplayer live service game, we didn't want our player to open up the game every single time and have no data associated with them or nothing about them. It's like they were a clean slate, right? It felt like you wouldn't be able to make any progress at all if every time you opened it up you had, oh, I have no stats, or I can't view anything, I can't earn and keep anything. So like player accounts was like the obvious out of the box like Playfab requirement that we wanted, so our players could actually feel like they own and are something inside of our title. Something else we used was the leaderboards and statistics. So the way we kind of leveraged that was kind of try and give player incentives, as well as kind of mix it up with daily, weekly, and monthly leaderboards. The system in there is pretty strong. There's actually even a version 2 that is I haven't experimented with yet, but I know some of the new feature sets that it came with. And basically, it kind of allowed us to allow players to compare their stats across accounts. So with your friends, you could go view friends leaderboards or global leaderboards, and some people are really into that, especially into the multiplayer world. And so this was kind of an easy add as well for us for incentives. Back on the player accounts real quick as well. Just well, actually, no, I talked about it. I'll go ahead and skip on that. Something else that we utilize is something called content management. It kind of gives you yourself like the title. It gives the title identity. It allows you to store certain sets of data for the title that are able to be accessed globally. So I'll get into these later in slides, but something called title data, which is just think of like a key value store, and then title news, which is something else that's kind of beneficial and useful in a particular way. Um, Something else we went and used was in-app purchases and in-app earnings from the economy system. Basically, we had cosmetics that people would buy, or our game used a mechanic of grapple hooks and jetpacks, and so you could change some certain features and visuals about those, and so we had those inside of our economy as well. Something else that we were able to utilize a lot was automation. Playfab is a pretty cool and extensive way you can do automation on either player accounts with basically any variable or anything inside of Playfab. The types of things we used it for was, funny enough, account culling, because our game was free to play and we wanted to stay under the 100K limit. We kind of set a criteria that players could fall into an account culling based off certain properties. That's like a whole nother conversation, but we could allow that to automatically run, and that could kind of help us control things as needed. And then other utility functions that we needed to use, can't really remember one off the top of my head, but any type of times we needed to run like maintenance things, like we made an update to how a statistic works on the front end client, and so now we need Playfab to go run this function on everybody's stat. We could go do something like that, and it would kind of help us manage the data and churn on the accounts. And then lastly, just for the things I'm going to talk about for the first title, is real-time analytics. So we were able to watch live logins, see roughly where people in the world were able to log in, and then also watch kind of live match results and data come through as well. That was a lot. So all that being said, now that we're working on a new title, and I promise I'm gonna get to all of these things particularly, I might have ordered this a little bit out of order, but now new features that we've have messed with and are going to new titles, or the new title that we are working on is matchmaking in groups. This is probably one of the biggest ones, along with multiplayer servers, that I'm really excited to mess with. If you're, in a multiplayer title, depending on how serious it is, sometimes you need to deliver like a higher standard of network quality and stability for your game. And so Playfab has a pretty good and extensive way to manage deploying servers so you can have a stable network and stable kind of like authorization and Corewell dedicated server for your player rooms. And then they also have pretty good services for being able to match players together based off criteria. So like your biggest default example you might see is quick play and ranked in like any most competitive or most like multiplayer games. Of course, that can be turned into really anything you want, any type of playlist, right? So that could be, I want to play these subset of game modes. I want to play just these maps, or like any criteria you'd want to like allow a player to go do and control. You can kind of throw these into these buckets. And then, that kind of allows you to do this here. One note I do want to make on these two in particular: you can use matchmaking in groups without dedicated servers. You could kind of do it like they are separate things. So if you don't want to do dedicated servers, you don't want to run the risk of having to, or you don't want to do the cost for dedicated servers either. Something you can do, like let's say I just have, I don't know, some game and you have some player account and you want to match people based off their player accounts, right? You could have a quick play and then say, hey, out of all the people playing, find the people closest in the same region, and then find the people that are queued that have the closest, account numbers. And you can add a bunch of things to kind of make that change over time. New things as well as we're messing with the new economy V2, which is a bunch of new stores and sales. That's in another slide I have. And then something that I actually don't know too much about, but I'm still learning, is the CDN content delivery network, which possibly has the chance of helping us host asset bundles. I don't know what the Unreal equivalent is, but for Unity, asset bundles is kind of a way to manage content that doesn't exist in your client original download, but downloads after the client fully downloads the game. So I'm excited to mess with this because it could be very useful for us. So that was a lot of words here. Let's see. So something that's I'm going to take a break from talking about features. Yeah, so all of this is actually set up with different APIs, and Playfab has actually decent documentation for most of it. When you're using it in Unity or Unreal, they have an SDK you can just kind of call functions on, which ultimately just call their APIs. So kind of up to you how you want to set it up, but because of that, it all boils down to REST APIs. Oh, yeah. So as long as yeah, I totally expect you to be able to just use the REST API version and utilize it that way. I was surprised that Godot wasn't listed. I'm unsure if they're working on a particular SDK. There might be wrappers that exist already, or like people like community made SDKs. But yeah, this can get pretty pretty vague as far as like what it has to be tied to. I've used it in Discord bots. Like, it's pretty. I'm not the word I've lost, but you can kind of use it a lot. Pretty nice. Happy enough with the rest. Perfect. Yeah. So I think you'd be able to do pretty good there. And if you remind me, I'll find that documentation and I can shoot that over to you directly. So yeah. So something else I wanted to point at real quick is just kind of the dashboard overview. Kind of what you open when you first open the game, or open your kind of title view. Something that's nice as well about Playfab is, and as you get more into the different types of features, it kind of has this nice way to kind of let you know everything about what's going on in your title, right? How many like it allows you to see how many new users you have, your recurring users, if you're having any spikes in any of your API calls or cloud script processing times. We were able to see a few times of our game being live, we were able to see some giant spikes and able to kind of go figure out what that was. But we saw it early enough because we saw the earliest calls happening in our cloud script. And then as we utilize, more of our multiplayer servers, we'll be able to see our utilization here. But it kind of gives you just a quick look at report so that you could keep up on your screen to just kind of watch and monitor if you feel like while your game's live, and kind of gives you a nice kind of understanding of like, hey, what is going on in my game right now? What's kind of happening? What's the vibes? Kind of stuff like that. So it allows you to do some customization to it, which I think is kind of nice. But just kind of thought that was always useful and helpful, and I wanted to leave it here. All right. So going to talk a little bit more into specific features from now on, just kind of going through. And then when I get to the end, I'm happy to talk about anything in particular, or if there's anything you think I missed, again, please feel free to just ask. So authentication is probably the biggest thing that you get with using Playfab, or like the you use it out of the box. And it kind of allows you, how do you authenticate a user with Playfab in general, right? Like you have all this account data, you have all these stats, these items that players might have spent money on. How do you do that, right? So the supported platforms is pretty widespread, and it has a catch-all for platforms that it doesn't have particular API or particular calls for. So it has most the generic supported authentication types, right? Facebook games or Steam, PlayStation, Twitch, all the way down to just username, password. Something I didn't put on here, it also has support for a custom ID. So like for my use case for Oculus, when we want to tie an Oculus ID or a Meta ID, sorry, Meta ID to Playfab, we can grab that user's kind of like particular ID on game launch and kind of put that in and send it to Playfab and use that as a form of authentication. That's pretty nice. So you can do kind of these kind of token strings if you would like to use for auth. So just simple setup on here, which makes it really easy to really kind of switch between. I know our last title did Meta authentication, which was just the custom IDs. We used username and password for the longest, and then we also used Steam. So you could open Steam, and then it could kind of get your credentials, not get your credentials, but get your token and go through the Steam SDK and log in through there. And so this is just kind of what a typical setup might be. If you have a platform specific SDK, you can typically work with that, pass those credentials in like a custom script. So for Unity, custom CS script, and then call the login, particular login API call to Playfab, and then it will help you handle off pretty well. This was very easy. I was really impressed with of how simple it was to get something like this working when I first tried this out. So I was pretty happy with that. So account structures. There's a little bit to note here. On the screen here, you'll see. I'll talk about some of this in a moment. But there's kind of two types of accounts per user. There's the master account, and then there's the title account. And the reason that matters is, so if you see in the screenshot above, we kind of have this banner. Corrupted Media is like our studio, right? So let's say you're going to have multiple live service games, etc., right? So you have a studio, and then you have a bunch of Playfab titles that exist under that studio, right? Some games are really fancy, and you can do things cross games that the data needs to swap from different titles. Go play game B and do this thing, and you'll unlock something in game A. It seems to be a pretty good live service thing that a lot of studios do to try and cross populate like their player base across their games and titles. So that's kind of what a player master account becomes when a new account's made. And then there's referencing a title account, which is talking about the data particular for that user within inside of a title. So if you're just starting out, just learning, etc., title account is what you're going to learn most of. But every now and then you'll see something like, you see like title player ID and then master player account ID, and you'll be like, why are there two? That's kind of just a little bit difference there. Just to kind of wanted to point that out. Awesome. So a little bit more on like what is an account and what can you do with it and why it's a thing. There's a type of, like this is kind of like the bare bones basics thing of like Playfab and what makes it nice and useful. So on screen I have, funny enough, my user account for one of our titles. I don't even know if this might have been the vertical shift title, but it doesn't matter because you won't be able to log in with this ID. Haha. But you'll kind of peep at these tabs, but a lot of different things you can store as a user. The different types of ways you can store identity for a user is how I kind of like to say it. Is let's talk about ID player data. This, but different things like friends accounts is probably the easiest one to kind of start with, right? Because we've talked about accounts. We know accounts exist in a multiplayer live service. Typically, like at least for me, I don't want to get on unless I'm hanging out with friends, and so I want an easy way to connect with my friends. And so being able to kind of link these accounts to each other. So when a player logs in, you can be like, hey, get my friends list, and then you can kind of load that into Steam, or you can kind of load that into whatever other kind of version on your client you want to mess with and use, kind of stuff like that. I think I get into most of these individually, so I'm just gonna kind of go ahead and move forward here. But yeah. So yeah, okay, cool. So player data under the player accounts. Something that's kind of cool about this is at the like core like fundamentals, it's just like a key value pair, and you can have a couple different versions of them. You can have the player data, read-only data, some internal, and then you can do that via make that, is it the publisher like the studio, or is it particular to just this title? And so some examples that this is a little bit older as when we were using this though, but for example, early systems for us on our old title was like managing quest unlocks. And I know it's really silly, like looking at it here with like ones and zeros, but all of this stuff does have like data size limits per account. And so we were just trying to stay as little amounts of data. You could put JSON in there if you want and have the space. And we even started messing around with doing some of that now. But basically, we're like, all right, how do I store kind of this weird random data that's unique-ish to my game? And so we were just like, all right, here's my key, here's my value, here's my data, and you can request all the player data from the client after a login and be like, hey, I want to go through, give me my quest unlock data and pass it through, whatever subclass or managements or services you have to handle that data. But it gives you a nice place in the cloud to store it. So when the player leaves, and comes back, they still have data where they left off. Steam, a lot of platforms have their own achievement systems and stuff like that, right? But if you want to do cross-platform, for example, let's say you want to be able to play the game on Xbox, but also be able to play the same game on your Windows machine. or PS5 or whatever, being able to store achievements, for example, up here is pretty nice as well. Because you can kind of keep like the core of what is unlocked in the game, and then allow the platforms to kind of do the rest depending on how you want to handle it. Um, Something else, I think I mentioned the friends, but just kind of wanted to show this dashboard that's pretty nice and pretty easy. Let's say like you do like a standard friend request inside of a client, whether that's be, you can follow someone without having them to accept it, or it's like a two-way acceptance, like you do a request and then they give a response, etc. After you handle kind of all of that transaction, you can be like, all right, this person's our friend now, and then just send up a link and a link to that Playfab ID for an account, and it will add that into the list of friends. So that way, whenever you log in again, you get that data. Something that's good for in-app purchases for a lot of people like to do is you can kind of go see and manage everyone's in-app purchases for their game. So this is from 2023, I guess, purchases I was making. Oh wow, all the way down to 21 for like one of my accounts. And you can kind of see and manage what type of items people were buying, or if someone had a problem with any of their IP purchases, you can kind of come back and manually manage it, depending, like assuming you have some type of ticket system for people to report those types of problems. But another thing, something else you kind of not oh my gosh, sorry, something else you get to kind of keep track of with accounts. Um, I mentioned leaderboards and stats. Something that's kind of neat is that statistics are, kind of all of those variables you might want to keep specifically for an account that you might also want a leaderboard on. And so that's kind of like the main difference of why wouldn't I just store this in like player data. Um, so like any stat that you might want to be able to have a leaderboard, you'd put as a statistic. So for us, we had like fastest lap for race. We had different stats for our quests. The biggest thing we also had most of our players really liked was tags. I don't remember the actual name of it, but there's times tags and like different types of things and metrics that players care about. But you can track all that here, and then you can turn those into leaderboards really quickly that allow you to kind of gamify a lot more things easier. And so each account, of course, has all their statistics tied to it. And with leaderboards and automation as well, you can kind of reset those, based off the daily, monthly, weekly, kind of depending on however you want to as well. Something else I did not talk about here is, or maybe I do later, is drop tables. No, I'm going to save that for later. Actually, we're going to go ahead and get into the inventory. So of course, just like seeing people's transactions, you're able to see and manage and gift um, items inside of people's inventories. So let's say you go earn a bunch of either cosmetics, or you go find them in a game from a drop table, etc. You can kind of see and have all of these cosmetics attached to a player account as well. And actually, I'll dive into these into a later slide as well. I guess that's right now. So that's kind of a little bit or a quick rundown of player accounts themselves. So I'm going to kind of transition into stores, items, inventories, and non-account stuff. So if there's any account questions, feel free to definitely ask those and chat. But on a different side of the Playfab world is kind of managing items and like bundles and stuff like that for your game. Let's say a lot of live service games, Fortnite, Rainbow Six, building your own, like Vertical Shift, stuff like that. You want to be able to manage a lot of different earnable items or consumable items. Um, and Playfab has a pretty customizable way to kind of set up your own items and do a lot of different things with them. For example, what's here is a hair comb over object. So this was just like the the data model side of like owning like a comb over model that you could like put on a player, or like if you want when you customize your player. So this is what that data would look like on the back end side and kind of your catalog. We called it the vertical shift warehouse. Think of it, because I always kind of thought of it like doing like a where you'd own all your items and ship them all out and stuff like that. I don't know, felt clever. But you can see you can create different classes of like your items. So like this would go in a hair class. And then if you wanted to have like your own URLs and images to show up for it, you could do that too. Something that was neat is the difference between durable and consumable. So items you could earn or earn and keep, or earn and use once. Kind of have that change there. Manage if you want to be able to stack, or if you can trade these items. It's all dependent on your game and your goals. Um, And something else that you can do as well with these items is, and I haven't gotten into currency yet, but you can, let's say your game has multiple different currency types. So for us, we had BC and GC, which is basically bought coin, so coin that people paid money for, and then gained coin, which is like gain coin you would earn during like matches and playing the game itself, right? Because we wanted to give options. And so you can come in here and kind of set the prices for this item at like a base set. And then if you needed any other extra data to be tied with that item, you could kind of put in your key value custom data here. Do I talk about stores? I don't. All right. So something else you can do kind of in here as well as like the bundles. And so the bundles we used and I thought was really nice is just a way to kind of box a couple items together. So for us, it was like a new account was created, right? And we wanted to gift them the default cosmetics that players had because we didn't want our default cosmetics to be unique or work out of the system that we've created here. So we created the default cosmetics and put those in a bundle. And then as part of the new account creation process, we awarded the player with that bundle, and then they would default to those cosmetics. Um, Storefronts are cool. Storefronts are kind of allow you to set up different shops that maybe, whether you want to have like a store that just shows hair or a store that does a particular thing, or the way I like to think of it is like, for example, you like your daily deals or something that you might find on the front of a game, kind of give you like a creative way to show particular sets of items. Or let's say you had a store that kind of had a random subset of items on that storefront. And then in a store itself, you could run sales on particular items off the base price that would like be down here, stuff like that. So it's just kind of a nice way to customize a lot of the item browsing and seeing experience. And then of course, drop tables will basically allow you to manage the percentage of drops. If you happen to have different types of functionality in your game where you wanted to do percentages, you can manage that in the back end as well, which of course means, all of this means if you wanted to change the percentages of drops or anything you did this, a lot of this doesn't require front end updates, which is kind of the goal of a lot of this stuff. Talking a lot, running out of breath. Thank you guys for listening so far. um Something else that Playfab has is something called title data. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but it's kind of a way to add global data for your title. Um, the funniest thing I always like to think of when I kind of early thought of this, or the easiest concept, was just like, let's say I wanted all games across the world to sync on like one particular time of day. And so like that would, and I could turn that into whether it was like sunny or night inside of the game. And so I would, you could put a title data here and it could kind of just update with its variable and then allow, pull that time when a player logs in to kind of sync up with something like that. And I was like, oh, well, haha, I'm sitting on my phone. I log into Playfab and I'm going to make it nighttime for every player logged in on my game or something like that. So that was like the first thing I ever thought about something like this. But we utilized it for a couple different ways in our last title. So we used some of it for managing some like bots and data. We used some of it for actually creating like slideshows of URL images. So we would like fill, for example, this URL slideshow title data pair was basically a way we could we wanted a slideshow in our game, but we didn't want to have to update the client every time we wanted to change the images that were shown in the game, right? And so an easy way to do this was we just made a JSON list of URLs that we stored in some type of Azure bucket somewhere. I guess blob is what Azure calls it, and stored it in an Azure blob. And then that way we could just update this. And then every time a client logs in or every time they go to load the images, they get the most up to date and we could kind of alter it. So we use this a lot for like promotional images or stuff on billboards we wanted to change in and out. And so like that was cool. Another feature we did is add, just store like a true false, right? For store, like doing like store enabled and feature enabled. Like you get more complex, but out of the box, really easy to do stuff like this. The reason is if we were pretty new to doing in-app purchases at the time, and we wanted to have a way to block the clients from attempting to buy things in case we found any of our problem or any of our stores had problems or any of our like setups of like how we were handling money had a problem. We wanted to be able to turn that off at an instant without having to do anything weird like pull the game or stuff like that. And so simple global feature flags was another way we utilized title data for our game. And so that was also pretty nice. Um, yeah. So moving into title news, I know this is all a lot. I will try and yeah, I know this is a lot of information. But something else that Playfab offers that I thought was really neat was something called title news. It seems a little weird being just, it's like, well, it's just another way to have an ID and data to download, right? But something that this was kind of particularly catered to was like welcome screens or like things that you'd want to like for yeah like the basic things like for example we had like an announcements page and then we had a welcome screen. So let's say you wanted to have something that updated the welcome screen every time you like open the game, right? You want to say, hey, we have an update coming out soon, or hey, join our Discord, or like really whatever you could set this up and kind of set this body of data up and utilize that somewhere in your game, right? Whether you want to snag it after login and display it on the welcome screen. Something we got creative with is we put our privacy policy in it. So that way we could update our privacy policy if needed. Or really, we only put it like once, but like if we needed to update it, we could update the privacy policy and just have that data in there. And then one of the ways I think we got creative with it was loading screen tips because those were always changing and we didn't want to have to put new builds in. But basically, while the player was changing between scenes, we just had a bunch of one-liners of like hopeful, like helpful tips we hope would help the player. And so we could put all of that in its own title news and then parse it into a list, which you could, arguably use title data for that too. But we just kind of ended up doing that with this. Oh, something that's big for title data here as well, or sorry, for title news as well is, and I can't believe I didn't talk about this, but the ability to set up the different versions of different language versions because, you may not expect to have this localized in your project. You are able to set up the different versions of your announcement if you needed to, and then have each client pull their version, right? Because most games, whatever kind of data is in the game, you'd kind of expect it to be localized there, or depending on however you set it up. But this did give you the ability to have the multiple languages set up for when it grabs the body, and that was pretty cool. All right, moving into multiplayer and matchmaking. So this is something I've probably I've had maybe year worth of experience in now. Still learning and messing with it, but kind of the multiplayer matchmaking section of this, particularly the dedicated servers, is something I'm really excited about with our next title, kind of giving us the ability to have more stable lobbies and a more, for me, more like stable competitive environment. But like some games, you just want to run it on not, a Quest 2 or like rely on someone else's PC that you don't know what the spec is going to be to kind of run and mandate a lot of your games like decisions, right? Or, if you have a pretty complex game and you need a beefy server to or a beefy VM to run, it kind of allows you to get more control of that and, why you might come to something like this. Um, so the dedicated servers are pretty cool. It allows you to kind of deploy a certain amount of servers in different regions. So you can, whatever region, the PlayFab has an official region list, but it's all the regions you'd expect. But allows you to control the amount of dedicated servers, their ramp up time. You can put them on schedules. So you could say like, I know my peak hours is 6 p.m. So I'm going to start ramping up my standby servers at 5 p.m. or 5:30 that way, and then ramp them down at night. So I'm not churning, dollars and VMs and a lot of control over just kind of running and deploying these servers as needed. Kind of lets you, like I said, set up those schedules, but you can also set up triggers that will like happen automatically, right? So you're like, hey, my server load is at 80% capacity. I'm going to allow 2 more dedicated servers to deploy in this region. And it just kind of allows you to scale up and down a lot, right? Like, let's say, a lot of these kind of like quick like games that get picked up by streamers and then they have a million players overnight, right? Now, if you were, self-hosting and stuff, you get that on the cheaper side, but let's just say you had, studio budget behind it or something, you could just say, okay, scale. Like you could just say scale as much as you need and allow that to happen, and Playfab would be able to handle it up. Now, of course, Playfab recommends that if you are going to have like a, you know, 2 million concurrent user login like burst, right? Like you're launching a huge title and you're in a large studio doing stuff like that, they want to work with you directly so they can schedule, so they can have, more utilized VMs and stuff. But like it's basically just an easy way to scale up as needed, and handle all your matches, and it gives you a bunch of data about that. Um, Something I mentioned as well was queues, or uh, yeah, queues and matchmaking. And so this is just a little screenshot of being able to kind of customize a queue. And I won't talk too much more about it, but you can kind of, when you're setting up a queue, you can tie it to a particular build for your dedicated server. And so if you really needed, for some reason, you could have different queues run different builds, if that's needed. This can also manage, assigning teams, your min or max size to run a ticket. You can also run a bunch of different rules on your, so I guess Overwatch is maybe a good example. If you ever got into the higher ranks of Overwatch, or you play recently, sometimes the queues take a long time. The reason they eventually pop is because they kind of have these deteriorating or kind of roll off, rules, which is like, hey, for the first minute, I'm going to try really hard to match, the player accounts or something, or the MMR within this distance. And then after a minute or two, it's like, all right, we'll actually double it. We'll now add 50%, or et cetera, et cetera. And that way it's going to like kind of open the gap more and more, so the player doesn't have to wait for absolute ever. But it starts with the goal of giving you, the best matchup possible. So, as your players scale and you have more and more online, you can kind of tighten those rules a bit. But let's say at launch it goes a little bit slower, you can kind of open these weights and rules, and kind of help shape how players get queued and matched. And of course, all of this being on the dashboard and in the back end, that means you can change all this without a client build, which is kind of some of the biggest stuff. um yeah. All right, I know we're getting near the end of some of these slides here, so thank you guys for hanging out with me. Um, Something I'm not going to go too crazy in, mainly because I've only used it a little bit, but the analytics and control, uh, dashboard, Playfab has a huge and extensive way to get, analytics and metrics and monitor raw event data and export that out to other stuff. And so, you know, honestly, I might open up a dashboard panel and go through it, but allows you to see, everything from kind of your retention rates to player log on time to how often are they tabbing in and out of the game. That's something if you have to enable manually. Um, and then just kind of all of your trend lines that you would want to see, or like, someone in the business portion of your game might want to see, kind of all in one place in the back of, and some of the tabs. Also does some like audit history, and allows you to, like, again, export all the raw events so you can take it into a different tool and kind of, analyze your data if you feel like. All right, we're on our last two here as well. Something that's cool is A/B, that Playfab offers, is the ability to do A/B testing. Whether that's kind of a different, UI layout, or different button color, or maybe a different version of a game mode. Well, probably not that, because these are on individuals or groups. You can kind of run these control tests on different segments of users, which is basically just different groups of users. You could say, on my players that are rank plat and above, I want to try this, A/B test with this kind of percentage, and I want to see what type of data I get back. A bunch of cool kind of various stuff like that. So, um, you know, kind of like, I think Steam does A/B testing for their thumbnails and titles, and I know Meta does it as well. But this is kind of something that's nice to have, that you could kind of stay. You don't have to go to some other tool to do A/B tests if that's something you're into and like to do. All right, this is the very last thing, and then we can roll over to questions. Something I wanted to throw in here as well is, the ability to use Azure functions with Playfab, because you tie up your back end and your data and all this stuff in Playfab, and you're like, well, what if I want to do more? What if I want to get crazier? What if my game requires other stacks? What if I want to do X, Y, Z, etc. Um, Playfab works with Azure functions. It used to be Cloud Scripts, in a way that allows you to kind of, um, run commands in Azure functions with context of a player account. Um, and so, just a quick example, I have two examples here. In Vertical Shift, we wanted to store match data in Cosmo DB for MongoDB, which basically, just lack of other words, just a database in Azure that we wanted to use. And so we wanted to store and accumulate all that match data for each game. And so that would, include players, their stats there for that game, the teams, who won. And because VS2 ran off client hosts, as in like a particular person would be the host, we wanted that host at the end of the game to send us that data. And so at the end of the game, if you were the host, you would kind of wrap and bundle that data up from all the users, shoot it over to Playfab and be like, hey, I have this data package for you. And then it would know to link that to a particular Azure serverless function, which would ultimately just take that context and data from a player, and then using just MongoDB or CosmoDB interfaces and APIs, shoot that over and add it to our database. Um, Something else we used it for was which I don't have a thing here, was calculating the credits you earned after playing a game. We would send the stats up to Playfab. Playfab would churn on the number data and be like, oh, you gotten this percentage of, you were the second best player in the game. You had this many tags, this ratio, whatever. We're awarding you this percentage from zero or min to max points or score, and then that would come back down to the client. But the actual addition of coins and credits would be done off of the client, so that they couldn't really hack into it, right? The client couldn't just download one of those Unity breakers and just be like, I want 1,000,000 coins and do that. But this was like a nice way to kind of do it in a off the client route without spinning up a bunch of backend servers. Um, Something else we used it for was in-app purchases. So a client would initiate a purchase with Meta. Meta would handle the purchase and then kind of tell them it was complete. After that was completed, that status would go to Playfab, which basically just handed it off to Azure Functions. Azure Functions, with context of the client's Meta ID, would be able to actually call the Meta servers and be like, "Hey, Meta servers, we just got word that this client ID bought this item. Is that true? And did they actually, did the purchase actually go through?" And then the Meta servers, as a third party, would come back and be like, "Yes, it happened." And then the Azure Functions could be like, "Okay, cool. Tell Playfab to award that item to the client," and basically just means put it in their inventory. And then we'd pass back just like a true or false to the client, and so they would know to refresh their inventory and get it. But we were able to offload the actual things to keep things a little bit more secure. All right, that was a lot of talking from me. I hope that was useful and interesting, and there's a bunch of cool ideas. I am ready to personally move into the questions phase of this. I can go back and talk about anything in particular. I can try and address anything particular about your use case in your game. Um, Go back to any slides mentioned, but Sean, I think I don't know if you have anything to say, but I can see you already typing. And while I wait for some questions, I'm gonna grab a drink real quick because I forgot to do that. That's a good question, Sean. So Microsoft is this kind of interesting world of great documentation and bad documentation. I found a lot of the early the early stage features you would use, like the ones you would use the most, right? Like how to use an account or how to make an account, change a password for an account, like all that stuff. It's pretty well documented personally. Um, and so all of that of all the getting started and using the features that have been around for forever. Let me go back and point out some of these particularly. Um, so like player accounts, leaderboards, the economy, automation, like all the big core things are honestly pretty well documented, and I found it pretty easy to set up. That being said, some getting down to some of the later stuff with um dedicated servers and um a couple years ago IAP like functions, it was really kind of difficult to figure out, and that's kind of what led me to some of these Playfab communities and the Microsoft communities to get questions and basically just find out from people uh, that have done it before. Something that's a little bit annoying and maybe a Microsoft thing is Playfab used to have amazing forms, basically Stack Overflow for just Playfab, and then they decided to delete it and make everyone go to Discord, which means they basically deleted 5 years of form data of people's unique problems, which I personally think was a really dumb move. But so now you kind of have to get good at Discord if you can't find it in the docs. But I'd say overall, for the majority of things you're going to use, documentation is actually okay. Um, let's see. Seen something about solo pricing. I assume you guys were indie pricing, but I was wondering how that looks. Yeah, let me go find the actual um thing. And honestly, something I forgot to mention as well is they actually have pretty decent calculators if you're doing dedicated server stuff and like other prices of like, I have this much data, I have um, this much traffic. How do I what can I expect as far as costs? And just if you want to look yourself as well, there is the Playfab pricing. Um, so we've stayed, you're talking about solo pricing. Is that talking about the free to start pricing or like the pay as you go pricing? Gotcha. Yeah, no worries at all. We've been able to basically stay in the free to start. And the reason is when we did VS2, we were able to, or sorry, the vertical shift that's out, and some other kind of messing with it. We were able to, and I can find it honestly, probably in a title, but they list everywhere your storage caps per account and your throttle limits. And so if you're trying to scale within the free like section and try and stay in that, as long as you kind of monitor and be like, hey, I'm not going to dump 1 gig of data in this thing, you'll stay under all of the pricing plans. But I mean, we've been able to run um a decently sized indie game in the free to start for a couple years now. Ah, another good question. That's actually something we had to get good at. um yeah, so we were actually able to we being me and Sean, um we're actually able to set up like password resets back when we were using like user has to type in their own password and not just tying them to a service like Steam or Meta. We were able to set up a button inside of the headset that would send a password reset email, and that was something that kind of worked out of the box with Playfab. Um, Mainly because we were using username password, right? Or sorry, email password. And so that was we already had the email. And so if someone had a problem with their account, they could typically handle the password resets on themselves. And they were able to do that. Now, as far as data deletion, I know we've gotten some emails from the UK, and we've probably, I don't know, we've had a couple accounts that we get like an email to our studio's email account, and typically, they go and it's like, hey, I'd like to just delete my data. Game's not for me, or I, just don't want it, right? For whatever reason, it's pretty easy to go in and find that player account and then just kind of run the delete button. There's normally a big old delete master account or delete title account, and that can normally take pretty just few minutes. Now, if you wanted to automate that, you could build that into some system that automatically allows people to delete their account with some other service, or not with some other service, but like set up your own system so you don't have to do it as much as manually as we did. But that's definitely something that's handled within Playfab.
All right. Well, it looks like there's no more questions coming in, so we can probably call it here almost exactly at an hour. But thank you so much, Ben, for this presentation. This has been great.